Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jan Kamler, who is an expert on all things Jackal and actually other canids as well. So Jan is a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow. He is affiliated with the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit at the University of Oxford, but he has conducted research in the US, South Africa, Poland, Laos, Bhutan, Cambodia, and he's going to tell you about various bits and pieces at the beginning of his talk, so I'm not supposed to go into too much details, but his expertise spans canids, but also felids, so anything carnivory related, plus the occasional deer or mouse deer.
Yes,
Yeah, there we go, got it right. And it's my particularly big pleasure to have Jan here because he was supervising my master's thesis. So we go way back. Okay, so could I ask you to please give Jan a very warm welcome, and then we can
Thank you, Joanna. I'll just get right into this because it's kind of a long presentation. So first, to give you a little background about how I got interested in this research. I'm originally from Kansas. I got my bachelor's at the University of Kansas and my master's at Kansas State University. My master's research was on the ecology and interactions of 4 mesocarnivores: the coyote, bobcat, raccoon, and opossum. And of course, the opossum is a marsupial, but it fills the niche of a mesocarnivore. And I collared more than 70 individuals of these 4 species. The numbers in parentheses are the numbers of individuals I collared per species, to study how they coexisted and partitioned resources amongst themselves in a protected area. And we got a lot of interesting results about the home range sizes and habitat use. But the most interesting result was the frequency of interspecific killing by jackals on the other mesocarnivores. For example, jackals killed one of the collared bobcats, 20% of the collared raccoons, and 60% of the collared possums. Now, they were killing the possums for food because they were consuming them, but they did not consume the raccoons or the bobcat, suggesting they were killing them for competition reasons. And that always struck me as very odd that the coyotes would go through all the effort and danger of killing adult bobcats and adult raccoons, but then not consume them. And evolution doesn't misfire very often, so the jackals must have somehow benefited from the killing and exclusion of potential competitors. And I've been fascinated by that behavior ever since. So a main conclusion was that coyotes exhibit hyperaggression towards smaller carnivores and can negatively impact them in protected areas. And another example of that was red foxes. We assumed red foxes were on the study site within this protected area because they occur throughout Kansas and they're common in woodlands and grasslands. But we did not detect any of them in the camera traps, nor catch any of them in our traps, or see any signs of them. We did see them nearby, near towns and agricultural areas where there were less coyotes. But we think they were completely excluded from this protected area due to the high density of coyotes. Because we determined coyote densities based on their home range sizes and group size. And their density was about 1 coyote per square kilometer, which is one of the highest estimates in North America. And this was due to a very high and productive prey base. So we just think that the coyote densities were so high that they excluded the red foxes from this protected area. So basically, the presence of coyotes negated the benefits of protected areas for the red fox. I then went down to Texas to do my PhD on a similar subject, the ecology and interactions of coyotes and swift foxes. There was a concern about swift fox that was going to be petitioned as an endangered species or a threatened species due to massive range collapse. For example, they've lost 90% of their range in Texas and we're only left in 2 small pockets. And those were actually the small pockets that I studied them. And I collared more than 120 individuals of these 2 species to see how they coexisted. And basically, in a nutshell, I found that coyotes had a strong negative impact on the swift fox populations, primarily through predation and spatial displacement. And similar to Kansas, coyotes would kill but not consume the swift foxes. And I also found a perfect inverse relationship between the coyote and swift fox populations. And for example, on private lands where there was a lot of killing of coyotes, they had the most swift foxes. And in places where they didn't kill coyotes and densities were higher, they had the lowest or almost no swift foxes. And I think it's very unnatural for one carnivore species to completely exclude another carnivore species because these species have coexisted for millions of years together. So now, while all of a sudden is one able to completely exclude the other, like in Kansas, and now here in Texas. And I think that's due to the absence of wolves in these ecosystems. Because wolves, in turn, kill and spatially displace coyotes. And there's good research from Yellowstone National Park that shows when wolves were introduced, they decreased the coyote population by about 50%, again, through predation and spatial displacement, and it stabilized it that way. And so a lot of these carnivores, smaller carnivores, would benefit from the presence of wolves because wolves don't bother with foxes so much, but they do bother with the larger coyotes. And so I think what the data from Texas and Kansas both showed is that you need the presence of wolves to bring about a more natural equilibrium within the carnivore community. And that coyotes, due to their hyperaggression, are what I call super canid, and they can have unusually large impacts on other carnivore species, and they can be a conservation problem, especially for threatened small carnivores. And then after Texas, I completely changed gears and lived for 2 years in Poland. This is where I did my Fulbright postdoctoral fellowship in the Białowieża primeval forest, which many people consider the Yellowstone of Europe because it contains the last uncut lowland old-growth forest in Europe, and it contains all the original megafauna of Europe, except for the bear, although the bear is making a comeback there right now. So we radiocollared 35 red deer to study the impacts of wolves on red deer ecology. And we found that wolves affected a whole range of red deer behavior, from their daily movements, their seasonal home ranges, their annual home ranges, and their activity patterns. But what was most interesting is that the red deer home ranges in Białowieża were much larger than any other red deer home ranges found in Europe. And we think this was primarily due to the presence of wolves. This was the first time red deer ecology was studied in the presence of wolves. That's how rare it is in Europe. And what we found is that wolves were visiting every red deer herd, let's say every 1 to 8 days. So they constantly kept them on the move. The red deer couldn't stay in one area for very long, and it kind of spread out the effects of red deer browsing over a much larger area. And they couldn't concentrate their browsing in such a small area because the wolves would figure that out. If they were hanging out in an area for too long, the wolves would figure that out and hunt them. So they were constantly on the move in the presence of wolves, where in other areas of Europe, that's not the case. And also, what's important to understand, too, is that the humans can't mimic this behavior, this effect that wolves have on deer, because humans can go out and shoot them and decrease their numbers, but they don't keep them on a move on a daily and weekly basis. And there's good evidence to support this. They found similar results in Yellowstone National Park, because when they reintroduced wolves there, they found that the wolves affected the elk behavior and movements, which affected vegetative growth patterns and caused trophic cascades, and ultimately affected things like songbird numbers and butterflies. So it's clear that wolves are a keystone species, and they have a strong top-down effect on ecosystems. And I think the data from Kansas, Texas, and Poland showed that wolves are not only needed to help bring about a more natural equilibrium amongst the carnivore community, but also to bring about a more natural equilibrium between the herbivores and the vegetation that they consume. So I'm a big proponent of wolf rewilding, because I think that ultimately makes a lot of these ecosystems function a lot better. So now to give you a little background about the research in South Africa, black-backed jackals are a common but very controversial species in southern Africa, primarily because they come in conflict with humans in 3 different ways. One is their predation on threatened species, which is a conservation concern. One is their predation on game species, which is a monetary concern. And when I mean game species, what I'm talking about here is mostly like safari farms. Hunters go and they'll pay $20,000 or $30,000 to shoot this or that ungulate. If jackals are going on there and killing these young ungulates, that's costing these landowners a lot of money. And finally, their predation on livestock, which is a livelihood, a monetary concern. Now, despite concerns of all these various groups, jackal predation on threatened game and livestock species have never been quantified by research. So this is why we initiated this. And the objectives were to determine the effects of jackal predation on smaller carnivores, especially vulnerable species, and determine the effects on both game species and livestock. And with these facts, see if we can make recommendations for reducing human-jackal conflict. So part 1, the effects of jackal on smaller carnivores, especially vulnerable species. Some background about this part is about Cape foxes. Data from hunting clubs showed that beginning in the 1980s, Cape fox numbers appeared to be declining across the country in South Africa, with current densities low apparently everywhere in the country. And those same numbers showed that jackal numbers appear to be increasing since the 1980s, with current densities high in many areas. So I thought, that might be related. Those 2 events might be related, the decreasing Cape fox numbers and the increasing jackal numbers, just like how we saw in North America. And again, there's lots of evidence from this that I just went over, the coyote-fox relationships from my PhD and wolf-coyote relationships from Yellowstone. So the question was, what are the interactions among canids in South Africa? Do they show these strong negative relationships as those canids in North America, or do they have a different type of relationship? So the specific objectives were to determine the home ranges and spatial associations of Cape foxes, battered foxes, and black-backed jackals. I included battered foxes in the study because they were very numerous on the study site, and they're very similar in size to the Cape fox, so I thought they might be competing for den sites in space, and that jackals also might be negatively impacting battered foxes. We determined their densities and group sizes, investigate their mortality factors, and also their food habits and dietary overlap. I also looked at their habitat use and activity patterns, but I'm not even going to present that here due to time constraints. Now, on top of these objectives, I had 2 study sites that differed greatly in jackal density. One was a nature reserve where they didn't hunt jackals that had a high density of that species, compared to private sheep farms, which heavily persecuted jackals and had a very low jackal density. So the objectives was to determine fox behavior on both sides, to kind of tease out what effects jackals were having on their ecology. So these were the study sites, both near Kimberley, South Africa. The first was Benfontein, that was a nature reserve that had the high jackal density. And then less than 5 kilometers away were sheep farms, where they had jackal-proof fencing around the property, and they did intensive hunting inside, where jackals were virtually absent. And here's the habitat of the region, mostly grassland and shrubland with some trees in the ravines and on the hilltops. And this is the Cape fox, small 2 or 3 kilogram fox. And we capture them in wire box traps and then anesthetize them to take standard measurements, blood samples, place radio collars on them, and then release them at the capture site. And we did the same thing for the battered foxes. They were also captured and processed and then released at the capture site. And finally, for the black-backed jackals, they went in intercage traps, or very rarely. We just got a couple. So we had to catch them in rubber-padded foothold traps. And we processed them the same way, and then also released them at the study site. All of these animals were tracked via radio telemetry, antennas mounted in the back of a truck, and these are 4-element antennas, are very accurate for determining the locations of radio-collared animals. So some capture results. I ended up capturing 19 Cape foxes, pretty evenly divided between the 2 study sites. There were many battered foxes, 42 in total, again, pretty evenly divided between the 2 study sites. And again, the jackals, they were just on Benfontein primarily. And then looking at some of the mortalities. For the Cape foxes, there were 7 confirmed deaths, 5 of which were from predation. Now, these collars, they had a little mercury balance in them, where if they remained still for 8 hours, they would start beeping twice as fast. This is when I knew an animal would die. And I can go in relatively quickly and investigate. And usually, this is what I would find when I would, go get the signal of a dead fox. I'd find a Cape fox just laying on top of the ground that didn't apparently look like it had any injuries. It just looked like it died there of disease. But when I would perform necropsies on them, I would skin them and perform necropsies. This is when I can tell their cause of death. Because you can see these series of canine puncture holes, both in the skin and in the flesh. It's kind of hard to see there. But these canine puncture holes are associated with hemorrhaging and blood clotting, which means the animal was bitten when it was still alive. If it was already dead, if the blood had stopped circulating, you wouldn't see this hemorrhaging around the bite. So we know it was attacked when it was alive. And we know the species based on the size and spacing of the canine puncture holes. For example, this is the lower jaw of a jackal to show you how it perfectly matches the spacing in the flesh and in the skin. And also it's the method that these animals were killed. What jackals do is they kill smaller carnivores using the bite and shake attack method. I mean, this is very similar to what a dog uses on a doll or a rag. They'll bite it, bite, shake, bite, shake. So these animals are basically overkilled. I'll find when I skin the animal, puncture holes all over the back of the skull. A lot of the shoulder blades are broken ribs. They're basically chewed all over their body, make sure they're dead, then they're just left there. Whereas we had one Cape fox that was killed by a caracal, and that was very different. First of all, the caracal consumed half of the Cape fox, but also when I skinned the front part of it, you just had see 2 canine puncture holes, usually on the back of the skull or on the neck. So that's how a feline would kill it. Just a few bites or a suffocating throat bite And again, felids are killing for food. Canids, especially jackals, are killing for competition. We also had 9 badger fox deaths. Most of those were from predation from coyotes. And we had a few blackback jackal deaths due to human hunting. Now, looking at the adult densities, the badger foxes were the most numerous. They had the highest densities on Benfontein. And then you had the jackals, and the lowest were the Cape foxes, very low density. And now when we look at the sheep farms, there are some things stand out, is you had almost 90% reduction in the jackal density on the sheep farms. A few of them got on the sheep farms, but eventually they were tracked down and killed. But this resulted in 3 times higher density of Cape foxes on the sheep farms. And the badger fox densities were pretty similar between sites. And so, I'm sorry, there's one more thing I can talk about. I did have a third site called Rue Report where I surveyed the carnivores, the canids, but didn't capture radio collar them. And on that site, I had about a 50% higher, I detected a 50% higher jackal density, but we didn't detect Cape fox densities at all, that there were badger foxes. So again, you have that perfect inverse relationship between jackal numbers and Cape fox numbers. And looking at home range sizes, okay, first, this is the sheep farms. So the Cape fox home ranges were about 10 square kilometers, and that's very similar to the swift fox home ranges I had in North America and to kit fox home ranges too. So it seems like just a 2 or 3 kilogram fox in a semi-arid grassland, they need about 10 square kilometers to find food, rodents, grasshoppers, beetles, and to persist on a year. Badger fox home ranges were much smaller because they're just eating termites. But the results got interesting when we compared that to Benfontein, because there you found Cape fox home ranges were almost 30 square kilometers, and it's very unusual for a 2 to 3 kilogram fox to have a 30 square kilometer home range. In fact, it was more than twice as large as the jackal home ranges, who are like 5 times larger than the Cape fox. So it didn't even follow the body size, home range size relationships. And there was very little difference actually between the badger fox home ranges between sites. Jackals did not appear to be affecting them as much, although they did affect their group size. On Benfontein, badger foxes were getting in larger groups, up to 12 individuals per group, to protect themselves against the jackals. And I could see that when jackals approached a badger fox group, they would tighten up together, get in a small group, raise their hair, raise their tail to kind of intimidate the jackal and make it go off. But on the sheep farms, where there were no jackals, the badger foxes just got mostly in pairs or 3 individuals. And so it was clear that the jackals were affecting the group sizes of badger foxes. Now, looking at the home ranges, these are the 7 home ranges of the family groups that lived on Benfontein of jackals. Sorry, this is 95% minimum convex polygon. And those are the 2 pairs of Cape foxes that I radio collared. And then here are all the badger foxes. So you can see when you just overlap their 95% area of use, it looks like everything just overlaps and nothing's avoiding each other. But when you look at their 50% core areas, and these areas are usually where they have their dens, where they raise their young, where they spend most of their time, you can see that the Cape foxes situated their core areas in between the jackal core areas. And when these Cape foxes would go out hunting at night, they would only use these areas. So they were spatially avoiding the jackals. And they knew it was a danger. And this is why their home ranges were so large here, whereas just 5 kilometers away, their home ranges were only 10 square kilometers because they didn't have to avoid the jackals. And the badger foxes, by the way, they overlapped both the Cape foxes and the jackals for the most part when they were foraging, but they also, when they chose their natal dens where they would have their pups, they did choose them outside of jackal core areas. They were trying to protect the pups. And looking at the food habits and dietary analysis, we collected hundreds of scats of all 3 species. And just some major results, we found that Cape foxes consume mostly small rodents. Badger foxes consume mostly insects, primarily termites. And jackals consume mostly ungulates. And a major conclusion was that jackal diets overlap very little with Cape foxes, less than 50%, and even less with badger foxes. So our results were not consistent with ecological theory of competition because jackals were killing and displacing both fox species despite little overlap of shared resources. Because most people say when carnivores kill each other, it's because they're competing over a shared resource, and so they really need to kill the other species to provide more resources for themselves. But we weren't finding that here. They weren't eating the same things. So the question is, well, why were the jackals so intent on killing the smaller foxes? And we think the primary reason of the competition between jackals and foxes appeared to be over territorial space. jackals did not like any potential threats to their pups. And so they cleared out these areas around their natal dens, around their core areas of other, especially smaller canids, other carnivores, but especially smaller canids. And this is due to their hyperaggression, because black-backed jackals, like coyotes, are what I consider a super canid. They're very hyper-aggressive, and they have an abnormally large impact on other carnivore species. And the fox species actually had a positive association with each other. We found that on Benfontein. They had their den sites very close to each other because they were both using the areas in between jackal core areas. And we found that jackals did suppress populations of Cape foxes, and Cape foxes could be completely excluded at the highest jackal densities. But on places like Benfontein, they did have subtle behavioral avoidance mechanisms that allowed the Cape foxes to coexist with jackals. For example, they had different activity patterns. They had a very specific den site selection and different habitat use that allowed them to try to avoid the jackal as much as possible. And again, it's very natural, I think, when one carnivore species can completely exclude another. So I think this system, like the one in North America, was very unnatural. And here it was due to the absence of all the large carnivores. I didn't mention this, but in this area of South Africa, all the large carnivores were extirpated more than 100 years ago because it's a sheep farming area. So the lions are gone, hyenas, cheetahs, African wild dogs, everything's been gone here for a long time. And that's the case for over 80% of South Africa. But we find that when jackals are in the presence of larger carnivores, they themselves suffer high mortality and possible displacement, especially by leopards. But also lions kill them, African wild dogs kill them, hyenas kill them, and cheetahs kill them. So it's actually the very same system that we're seeing in North America. When you remove the large carnivores, you see this release of the super canids, the medium-sized canids, who then have an abnormally large negative impact on the smaller carnivores. So some additional research that we did, we wanted to determine if jackals were impacting other smaller carnivores, not just the smaller canids. So I collaborated with the black-footed cat researchers from Europe, and the black-footed cat is listed as endangered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we were able to capture and radio collar 4 black-footed cats during the study. And what we found, and by the way, black-footed cats are one of the smallest felids in the world, and they're the only felid in the world that uses burrows. They don't dig their own burrows, but they use burrows of other species. And what we found is that they did not spatially avoid the jackal core areas like the Cape foxes did. But one of the 4 collared black-footed cats was killed by jackals, which means there was some competition going on there. I think they were safer because they could use the burrows. They were so burrow dependent, and they were very nocturnal. But nonetheless, the sample size was too small to make strong conclusions, but it was probable that jackals are negatively affecting other small carnivores as well, not just the canids. So some recommendations. Future research is needed on other species of small carnivores to see if they're also negatively impacted by jackals. And if there is a conservation concern, then jackal populations might need to be managed in 2 ways. One, through active human control, because we find that in places like on the sheep farms where the landowners heavily hunted jackals, the foxes did better there. Or the preferred method would be the reintroduction of large carnivores, again rewilding, which would bring that carnivore community more into a natural equilibrium. And the research does support this. Okay, so now part 2, the effects of jackal predation on game species and livestock. Again, jackals are heavily persecuted by sheep farmers due to their real and perceived predation on livestock, and the same goes for game owners, these owners of safari farms. And many in the conservation community believe these claims are exaggerated and that jackals should receive full legal protection. So who is right in these cases when you have 2 different groups claiming, they should receive full protection, no, they should be, persecuted and killed? We must get the facts. And I wanted to find out if jackals were predating on livestock and game species, could anything be done to reduce this predation? So for this part of the study, I had 3 study sites. The sheep farms again, Benfontein again, and then I used Ruiport Nature Reserve, which had 19 species of ungulate, very diverse. It was used for safari hunting. Benfontein only had 3 species of ungulates, mostly springbuck, which is like a gazelle, and then the sheep farms, which had mostly sheep, but also some wild ungulates. And for the methods, we collected jackal scats along roads on a monthly basis. We washed and dissected the scats to determine prey remains and percent biomass. And we could compare those results to the prey availability because we did census data for all the prey species. So we can see not only what jackals were hunting and consuming, but what they were preferring. And we census the jackal numbers through radio telemetry and set stations lines, which Dr. Bagnevska was in charge of. And we also calculated prey selection, just like I mentioned, using the total number of wild ungulates and the sheep's preyed upon. So I always talk about the big three of data. When I work on carnivores, I always try to get the big three: the carnivore density, the ungulate density, and the carnivore diet. And with that, you can determine predation impact and prey preferences. And with those data, we can calculate total cost of predation to the landowners. So some results, we collected and dissected almost 1,000 jackal scats from the 3 sites. And the major conclusions were that jackals consume primarily ungulates on the reserves, especially during the birthing periods. And that scavenging likely had a minor role in the jackal diets, because a lot of people said, well, if jackals are consuming ungulates, it's due to scavenging, and they're not hunting, live ones. But we actually found out, and I'll show you through the patterns, the seasonal patterns, that this wasn't the case. It wasn't due to scavenging. It was due to active predation. And on the sheep farms, we found that the sheep and lambs were major parts of the jackal diets. They basically substituted for the wild ungulates. And also that smaller prey items, such as hares, were often preferred by the jackals, but they had such low densities, they really ended up being a very minor part of the jackal diet. So here's some data from Benfontein, which again was dominated by springbuck. The springbuck here have 2 birthing periods, one in the spring and one in the autumn. And you can see during both of those seasons that springbuck comprised about 80% of the jackal diet. They were almost exclusively just eating springbuck during the 2 birthing periods. And all these other prey species, hares, small rodents, and fruits, were very minor parts of the diet. And even outside the birthing periods, jackals were still heavily consuming springbuck. And again, then we use the data from Rue report, where we can compare between 19 different species of ungulates and what jackals were consuming. And what we found, and again, why we know this wasn't scavenging, is we found distinct patterns in their predation of the different ungulate species. For example, all ungulates have basically 2 types of birthing behavior. One are called followers. And for these animals, they give birth within the protection of the herd. The animal can walk, within minutes, and they immediately stay and always are protected by the herd. They immediately start moving with the herd. So this includes blessed buck, black wildebeest, and zebra. And these percentages are the percent of the populations that are consumed by jackals. So for these species, they really weren't impacted little or at all by jackals. The other types of ungulates are what are called hiders. Now, for these species, the female leaves the protection of the herd. She gives birth alone, and she hides her fawn in usually tall vegetation or brushes or something, and she comes and nurses it twice a day for the first, say, 4 to 6 weeks of its life. It depends on the species. And we found that the jackals very heavily preyed on these hider species, and that the impact on the hider species depended on their body size. So, for example, springbuck, the smallest hider, jackals were consuming about 25% of their population on an annual basis. Red hartebeest, which are relatively large species, jackals were still consuming 15% of their population. Again, this is through predation on fawns, newborn fawns that they find hidden in the tall vegetation. And even oryx, a very large ungulate, which is even hard for adult lions to kill because of their sharp horns. Jackals were taking about 7% of their population through predation on unprotected fawns. And this just seems to be their ecological niche. When the ungulates are giving birth, the jackals go around searching for these fawns hidden in clumps of vegetation. They know they're there. They can't find them by smell. Through evolution, these species have adaptations, so you can't smell the fawns, so they have to find them by sight. So they actually go and check every clump of grass to visually see these and then predate on them. So again, this is why these specific patterns are why we know it wasn't just scavenging. If it was scavenging, then jackals should have been consuming relatively all of these ungulate species in similar amounts, and it would have been relatively low percentages. And then the question became, well, do jackals, okay, it's understood that jackals can go around killing these fawns hidden in the vegetation, but are they killing adult ungulates as well? Because as you recall, outside of the birthing period, springbuck were still 50 to 30% of the jackal diet, which suggests they were killing adults. And we have some evidence from another nearby game reserve. Now, this is an impala. adult female impala who appeared healthy. She was in a herd of female impalas. And what this jackal did, it was a female jackal, she picked one impala out of the herd and just started chasing it. And initially the impala was way ahead of the jackal, you know. It didn't look like the jackal was ever going to get it. But the jackal never gave up. And eventually the impala tired and it starts circling the impala, and she was trying to kick it. And then eventually it got around to the front of it and jumped up in the air, grabbed onto the throat, and held on till the impala fell to the ground, and then throttled it and killed it, and later consumed it. So yes, the answer is, you know, jackals can and do also kill adult impalas. They're so intelligent, again, they're super canid, they can even figure out how to kill adult impalas by themselves. And they're even more efficient at this when they hunt in groups, because they do hunt in groups also. But I was amazed that this jackal in particular had figured out a method, because this wasn't the first time that the jackal had done this. You can tell it knew exactly what it was doing from experience. That they can even figure out how to kill adult ungulates much larger than themselves, even solitarily. It's amazing. And here's some data from the sheep farms. The sheep in this region gave birth in the spring and in the winter. And in those periods, sheep were the major part of the jackal diet. Again, the wild ungulates are giving birth in the autumn. So basically, the jackals were just focusing on which ungulate species was giving birth at the time, because that's the easiest thing for them to kill is the fawns hidden in the vegetation. And of course, remember, they're doing it by sight, and the lambs are white. They're not even naturally camouflaged. So they're the most easiest thing in the world for the jackals to see. At least the wild ungulates are a bit camouflaged through evolution. So these lambs are just like candy laying out there for the jackals. And so some results based on the scant context. And what we could do is basically determine how many ungulates on each site jackals were consuming and what the costs were. And you can just look at it there. And one other thing I wanted to point out, though, was that our results were kind of consistent with what the landowners were saying. For example, on the sheep farms, the landowners were telling us, yeah, jackals are killing about 50 of our lambs, you know, every year. And actually, we came up with a figure that was very similar to that. So it didn't seem like the landowners were exaggerating about the effects of jackal predation on their game species or their livestock. So what can be done about this? I think one recommendation was to choose ungulate species that are less susceptible to jackal predation, such as the followers, and those that are large. And also, I think you can increase the number of alternative foods such as hares and fruits and shrubs through habitat modification. Because again, they preferred hares, but there just weren't enough. And they also, I didn't show it on Rue Report, fruits. When fruit in the fall, then jackals quit feeding on the ungulates and focused on the fruit, because jackals are lazy. They're just going to do the thing that gets them the easiest nutrients with the least amount of energy. So if there's a bunch of fruit on the ground, then they quit hunting the ungulates and consume mostly fruits. And on the sheep farms, I think we talked to the landowners. They can determine what season their sheep give birth, because they can let the rams in at certain times of the year. And so if they can shift their sheep lambing to coincide with the birthing of the wild ungulates, then that would help reduce some of the sheep predation. They can also increase the number of wild ungulates on their land, and also hares and fruit trees, because these things seem to be preferred by the jackals, and this would reduce, theoretically, predation on livestock. But I think the best method would be to use guard dogs. And some of the landowners, while we were still there, started using 2 guard dogs. And that seemed to be very effective. And the reason why I think that's so effective is because basically it mimics the Canid hierarchy system anyhow. Because you have these guard dogs going around the sheep. They're defecating, they're urinating, they're barking. They're establishing their territory, basically. And jackals would respond to that, just like they kind of avoid wolf territories and things like that. And if jackals get too close, then, the guard dogs are going to chase them down and kill them and harass them. So it kind of uses the jackal's hierarchical system against them when you use guard dogs. This is why I think it's so effective. And it did seem to be effective from the little time that they were employed while we were there. Just some other things we did during the project. I just want to quickly mention we had a lot of professional development and training with school children and also some students. There's Joanna doing her scent station survey for her master's project. And I also had other master's students. And I did a lot of, also when I study carnivores, you don't only study the larger carnivores in the ecosystem, but you also got to study the bottom-up factors. So we did distance sampling on the size to determine hare and spring hare numbers, and pitfall traps for the badger foxes to determine the abundance of termites. So it was a very intense research project. And finally, I just wanted to show you one more slide of what I've been doing recently. The past 7 years, I've actually been in Cambodia doing research on canids, specifically golden jackals and dholes, or Asiatic wild dogs, but also leopards, jungle cats, and leopard cats. And what was interesting is with the golden jackals, well, first of all, let me point out that in this area of Cambodia, it's open, dry forest. So you have a lush, grassy understory and deciduous trees. But in the dry season, which lasts 4 to 6 months, all these trees lose their leaves and the grass burns almost every year. You can kind of see it here. This is during the dry season. So the place looks like it's been bombed. There's like nothing there. So the question was, well, what do the jackals eat during the dry season? Because it lasts 4 to 6 months because they don't migrate. Some of the ungulates can migrate to evergreen patches. A lot of the small rodents and the small reptiles, they estivate. They go into burrows during the dry season because there's also nothing for them to eat. And of course, the dholes and the leopards are fine because they still have the ungulates to eat. But what are the jackals doing? And what we found, it was quite amazing, is that they were feeding mostly on termites. These, let's see here. These, they're called processional termites. They go around in processions because these come out in the dry season and eat all the dead vegetation. And like we found termites in 75% of all jackal scats, and most of the scats were 100% termites. It reminded me of the bad-ear fox scats that I collected in South Africa. Now, jackals were never known, any jackal population was never known to feed primarily or subsist primarily on termites. So again, this is because golden jackals, like black-backed jackals and coyotes, are considered a super canid. And they're very adaptable, very smart. So super canids doesn't just mean that they're going out and killing large ungulates. They can also figure out to even kill and subsist on the smallest prey available. Because we did not find any termites in the dhole scats, the leopard scats, or scats of any of the small felids. It was only the jackals that were taking advantage of this. And we confirmed this with DNA of the scats to see which species these scats were coming from. We also found, well, first of all, this is the first jackal ecology study in a natural area. Jackals have been studied in Europe and in India, but in places that are heavily impacted by human. This place that we were studying them had no villages, no farmland, no livestock. So it was the first study of jackals in a natural area. And their home ranges were larger than any other studied jackal population. And we think that's because there was no food subsidies provided by humans like crops or livestock, and that it was such a harsh condition, this dry season created such a harsh condition for them. By the way, they also ate, about 17% of their diet were civets, because civets also lived in these forests. So again, you have this impact of the super canids on the smaller carnivores. And just to show you some other interesting results, the dholes, which get in larger packs than any other canid in the world, we found that they were feeding mostly on the smaller muntjac, whereas the leopards, we found that they were feeding primarily on Benfontein. And this ended up being the first leopard population ever studied whose main prey was larger than 500 kilograms. But it was only, again, we did DNA on the scats, and for the leopards, we did extra analysis to determine the males and females. So we knew which scat came from a male and which came from a female. We found that the males, the larger males, were the only ones eating the Benfontein. The smaller female leopards were eating mostly the muntjac. And then also jungle cats. This was the first study ever to do DNA analysis on the jungle cat scats. We found they were mostly eating rodents and hares. And the small leopard cats were eating mostly rodents. And by the way, this was just showing we had lots of students in this project, some which got their DPhil at Oxford University, and 2 of my research assistants got their diplomas here at Wild Crew in International Wildlife Conservation. So that's the end. So thank you for paying attention. These are different ways also to say thank you in South Africa, because they have 11 different national languages. So you guys can ask me any questions you have about any of those species that I talked about.
Great. Thank you, Jan.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any questions?
Quick question on distance sampling. Was that using light shine to detect What was that?
Yeah, right. We did it at night,
Yeah.
and we had binoculars. So whenever we saw the eye shine, we would focus through the binoculars and had range finders to determine the distance. Yes?
Thanks, Ian. That was a wonderful overview and beautiful, clear slides. It's great that you were able to make recommendations for how the prey species might be manipulated by changing the species of ungulates. Will you be able to study the impact of that? Is that something that's going to be possible in the future?
I mean, it might be in the future. I mean, because I remember I moved on from South Africa to Southeast Asia. That's where I've been for the past 7 years. So I haven't really followed up on what they did. But I know that most of the landowners are starting at least to use the guard dogs, and they like them. They can even see the impact of guard dogs.
Changing the distribution of the ungulate species, that could have an impact on the habitats.
Yeah, right. Now, that hasn't been looked into. But theoretically, that should happen because what we found in this study is even on the sheep farms, that the jackals still preferred, if both are available, the jackals still preferred wild prey. And all studies kind of show that even with wolves and even with leopards, there's something, even though livestock are easier for them to kill and the lambs are wide and easier, something about these wild, they still prefer their natural prey if it's available. Yeah. And so increasing, they've done this with jaguars too, increasing, so other studies have done it, I haven't, but other studies have found that if you increase natural prey, for example, they did this with jaguars, then that will reduce predation on livestock if you give them an alternative.
Yeah, it's great to have evidence-based guidelines.
Right. But we didn't follow up on that, but other studies have.
Great. Any other questions? We'll have this one first and then...
It's really amazing how these jackals have gotten into the smaller canids.
Yeah, right.
Is this something, is there any other example of this in the animal kingdom where you have a range of predators of different sizes where they will kill the lesser ones? I mean, I don't know whether it would be hawks or weasels or cats or anything else. And if there isn't, is there something about the personality or the way of life of dogs that makes this behavior?
And that's a good question.
That brings it beyond the sort of mere evolution level.
Well, they find integral predation amongst many taxa, where if two species are competing for a shared resource against food, you can have the larger one killing the smaller competitor. A good example of this would be lions and cheetahs. They often compete for some of the same food, but the cheetah is more efficient at it. You know, their success rate in a hunt is like 70 or 80%, much higher than the lion. So what the lion does is then just kills the cheetahs, and that leaves more food for themselves because the cheetahs aren't decreasing the prey base. So this is found in like spiders, fish, raptors, this type of integral predation where the larger but less efficient hunter just kills the more efficient smaller one. But what you see here with what the jackals and the super canids are doing, that's different. I do think that this is unusual because they're going overboard because they're not even competing for the same food. At least those other species, they can tell, okay, they're eating the same food. That's what I was talking about. It should only happen when they're competing for something that's scarce. And here they're not competing. Termites are super abundant. Why are they killing the banner fox? So I think it's due to this hyper-aggression. I think all those super canids, coyotes, blackback jackals, and golden jackal, they're hyper-aggressive because they evolved in systems with larger carnivores, and they had to survive in that system with 4 or 5 larger carnivores. So they had to avoid the larger carnivores. They couldn't have their dens there anymore. They're the ones that had to have their dens and refuge areas. And so, and they had to be bold enough to go in and grab some scraps from a carcass or to challenge. Coyotes can get in groups, and if they outnumber if they outnumber the wolves, they'll chase them away from the carcass. If there's just like 2 wolves, there's 6 or 7 coyotes, they'll chase the wolves from the carcass. So they do get aggressive if they're in numbers, but they have to be bold. You can't just do that. You have to have a certain behavior to be bold, to go in there and start challenging some of these larger carnivores. They've been doing that for millions of years. But now all of a sudden you remove these larger carnivores and this kind of aggression that's kind of built into them, I think is taken out on the smaller carnivores, even those that they aren't even competing for the same resources, it appears like. That's what was so unusual about this to me, fascinating about it, is why they're doing this when they don't need to. The bobcats aren't doing this, and they're kind of competing for the same food. No other carnivore goes overboard like this. It's like overdrive. But again, that's because we've removed the large carnivores from these systems, And now we're kind of seeing what kind of unnatural effects it has on everything else.
Hi, thank you, Jan, for the talk. It's great. You attributed some of the black jackal response to the killing of the foxes to foxes protecting their pups from foxes. Did you actually see evidence of the foxes trying to protect the pups?
No, I mean, I don't think that a Cape fox necessarily would go and kill a jackal pup, because even the badger foxes and the Cape fox, they had their dens close together. They could have killed each other's pups, but they weren't. They don't have this kind of built-in hyper aggressiveness. But the jackal doesn't know that, because the jackals, they will kill each other's pups. This is why they're territorial against other groups. So the jackals, again, aren't just so aggressive towards the smaller carnivores. They're aggressive towards neighboring groups, at least those they're not related to. Sometimes if it's their daughter next to them, they're more forgiving and the daughter can come back and stuff like that. But in general, they're aggressive towards other jackal groups to protect their own pups, because if a jackal gets in there for competition reasons, they might kill their pups. So they just take it out on everything, though. You know, so whether that's a jackal or something they perceived as a jackal or a small jackal, again, they're going overboard. They don't need to kill Cape foxes and badger foxes to protect their pups, but they do. I mean, how do they know what's going to kill their pup? They just, because it's not a big risk for them. You know, challenging a hyena or another jackal is kind of a big risk. They can get hurt. But killing a Cape fox is very little risk for them. So why not just kill it just in case? You know, something like that. You know, it's not clear. It's just some kind of overdrive that's in them that's causing this. And there's
We've got a question from Bob, and then over here.
This sort of hyper-aggression that you're describing in the jackal, have you looked at whether it's from both sexes, or is it a particularly male thing?
Yeah, we think it's from both sexes, more so it'd be from the alpha pair, because the betas, all of these groups have betas, so they'll have young from their previous litter that stay for an extra year. They'll help their parents raise that litter. We don't see this type of aggression in them, and this even goes to the sheep killing. They've done studies in North America on coyotes and sheep where they did the salivary, they got the saliva from the sheep, and they found out in all cases it was the alpha pair. So again, they're the most aggressive. They have their own territory. They have to defend it against other jackals. They have to get the food. I mean, they even found that the diets differ between alphas and betas. The betas eat small rodents and stuff like that, and the alphas are the one eating the larger. So more so than a difference between males and females is a difference between alphas and betas. And there's also transients in these systems, and the transients aren't doing this thing either. The transients by nature are submissive. They go around with the tail between their legs because they're always in somebody's territory. And the betas are the same way. They're always kind of submissive, so they're not going to be overly aggressive all of a sudden towards something. Where the alphas, they're just naturally over-aggressive. They have to keep their territory from other jackals to, do this. So it has to do with their social class rather than gender. But both males and females will do it.
Is there any sense that they do it in front of their clans, it were, as a demonstration of power?
Yeah, that I don't know. I do know what I've seen sometimes, and I saw this in Texas, is that the coyotes are actually going out and waiting by the dens of the foxes. When I was spotlighting one night, I saw the coyote with its eyes and ears focused on the den entrances. They're actually waiting for the fox to come out. They were going to kill him. So they're making an active effort. But there weren't other coyotes around that I knew of. So I don't know if they're actually doing that as a demonstration of power, because I don't think they would need to, because they already have their power structure. It's very clear in wolves and coyotes. They know from 1 to 5 or 6 who's in line, and that's already kind of built into them. So I don't think they really need to demonstrate that with this type of thing, but who knows? I mean, maybe they do something like that. They wouldn't surprise me. I don't put anything past them anymore. And wasn't there one?
Yeah, there was.
I was just wondering, with the hyper-aggression, I mentioned with other grouping, the same species. Yeah.
No, I think it would tend to stay, because again, they're very aggressive towards others of their own kind. And so that's one of the reasons I think they say. What I think happened in the past is that you had the large carnivores or the wolves kind of spread out, these jackals and coyotes. So they didn't have so many pairs right next to each other. They were more separated because they had to avoid the core areas of the larger carnivores. And now you have them more packed together. There's a jackal territory on each side of them now when the large carnivores are gone. And so that just kind of makes them more aggressive. They have to constantly mark. They have to constantly show their dominance. If a transient comes through, they have to chase it off, and things like that. So that, I think, may actually make them even a bit more aggressive, perhaps. But I think it would stay in the system. Mm-hmm.
I suppose you might predict that if this aggression towards other species is a byproduct of the jackal's own social behaviour and competition between jackal packs and things like that, then in areas with very high jackal densities, you might expect more killing of the lesser canids than you would where they're lesser dense and they don't have to be so aggressive to each other.
Right, and I think that's true. Like, for example, in Kansas, the home ranges of the the coyotes there were like 3 to 4 square kilometers. It was very small, and they were all packed in there. So that's why there were no foxes at all. There's no chance for a fox to go in there and find some space in between 2 jackal territories. So I do think at the higher densities, when you have more territories in there, yes, there's more killing. There's not even a place sometimes for the smaller carnivores. And yeah, when you spread out, when you get larger home ranges, for one, they can't visit every part of their home ranges often, things like that. And then there would be more space for other carnivores to coexist in there. But it seems like the carnivores did the worst, for example, in Kansas, where you just had a very high density coyote groups packed in there next to each other. And there wasn't a way for them to avoid coyotes in that case.
Okay, one last question. If anybody wants one?
So, you skirted around or actually talked at the end about your other projects in Cambodia. So, what are the main objectives for those projects? I presume they're still running, are they?
Actually, no. I went back last year, and that was probably for the last time. It started out as being a Canid project. I was going after doles, and doing doles, and that turned into jackals. But then it switched to leopards, because on that study site was the last leopard population in all of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. The conservation of the large felids is very dire in Southeast Asia. So now tigers are extinct in all of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And this was the last leopard population. But now it's down to one individual. Because this is all for a snaring crisis for bushmeat, and to bring bushmeat to the urban populations. And it's gotten out of control with the snaring. And the large felids especially seem to be the most susceptible. And so now there won't be funding to go back, because we were getting funding to try to save this last leopard population, but now it's unsavable.
So what's the next project then?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm working on that. Right. I'm going to be moving on to something else now. All right.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jan. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.